That's fine.
We just never know when to start these things.
So it's really awkward at the beginning. So
sprint reviews. Oh, we ought to say where we are. Oh, I'm Henry Dittmer.
I'm Tricia Broderick. We can't assume that they watched last
just
week.
feel like I've been here the entire week.
No time has gone by.
We did change shirts.
And what are we covering today? Oh, yeah, I guess we should say again where we are.
Yep, we're at Tricia's house on her stairs, which we thought was a nice background, something different.
Yeah, last week we tried my dog in the screen and it didn't work out, so we didn't go for it again.
I've started a petition to bring back Amadeus, so.
But it has better lighting, so we're gonna go with this. Although it kind of feels like we're in jail. So,
yeah.
But that's what a sprint review can feel like sometimes.
Oh, nice move.
Oh, look at that transition.
We also should say the reason we're together again today is we're continuing to do the final touches on our AS Advanced CSM class. Yep. So we should have that done here pretty quick.
Really focused on facilitation and those skills needed for Scrum Masters.
Scrum Masters, yeah, advanced skills.
So you get us again today.
Very excited about that.
Yeah. This won't be a repeat. We're not doing next week's too, but you got a bonus 2 weeks in a row. So, so sprint reviews. I kind of liked our style that we did last week.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's really, what everybody was hoping for, I guess, but we got questions from it, things along those lines. But I kind of like what are some challenges? What are things that we've seen with it? Because I mean, we can all go read the Scrum Guide and read specifically what the sprint review is, but I think the dynamic of highlighting just things that we've experienced really was helpful. So I want to kind of go down that path again.
That works for me.
So what's something, and we'll kick it off before people start joining in on us and starting asking questions, but what's something that's been kind of, it's a big red flag when you see it in a sprint review?
Yep. When there's no stakeholders there. Which happens a lot.
Why would that ever happen?
That's probably the number one thing, and it just sucks the life out of Scrum and the team and so forth, right? It's interesting. Stakeholders sometimes don't they don't really appreciate about the incremental aspect of each one of the sprints, and therefore really understand that they get to see something that has meaning to them. But that aside from things that you can do to correct it, that business of not having stakeholders there, and the team winds up demoing to itself and reviewing to itself, right? There's nothing there to give you the feedback. I always point this back to the stuff you get out of The Drive by Daniel Pink.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Purpose.
In that sense, purpose. Yeah. So I have no stakeholder there. So what's the whole purpose of this thing? Why do I care? Why does anybody care, right?
I'll go one step further with that, because stakeholders, obviously, they're giving that feedback. But I really try and emphasize that we're changing this delivery to be done versus deliver to discover.
Right.
And what are we learning? And so for me, it's really terrifying when we're not using that second principle, the welcome changing requirements, welcome that dynamic of, are we getting that feedback? Do we want that feedback? Are we trying to update the product backlog? Are we trying to learn what's going to be most valuable? And not just trying to have the condition of success be whether or not we delivered versus the condition of success being, have we learned? Have we learned something more that's going to provide additional value? Because a lot of times if we don't have that right definition, people can actually start taking that feedback, even when the stakeholders are there, and get demoralized by it and have some of that same aspect. And so reinforcing that feedback is exactly why we're doing this and what we're trying, that inspect and adapt.
And that opportunity, therefore, to actually expand the collaboration to the team into the stakeholders or with the stakeholders, right? But some of my most favorite stories are when something catalysts that to happen. So, for example, I was at a review, and the stakeholder was at this review, so that was a good thing. And they're sitting there in the meeting, and as the team is doing the demo part of the review, the set of things that they had completed that week or that sprint, we heard one of the stakeholders sigh, right? I mean, literally go, right? Now, most people are afraid of that, right? It's like, oh, okay, what
happened?
But, you get bold, right? So we encourage the Scrum Master to actually ask and say, so what was that about, right? And the stakeholder's name in this case was Jimmy. And Jimmy said, oh, no, nothing about what I just saw. It just reminded me of all the things I got to do this weekend. And so the team got created an inquiry. I'm in trouble talking this morning. And they said, so what do you mean doing this week? And he says, well, I have to do this and this and this and this, right? And they said, well, we could automate that. And he's like, really? And so it was like, okay, well, let's encourage an experiment. What can we automate, right? So they come back to the next review. The team shows that they were able to automate a lot of the things that had caused Jimmy to sigh. And these are the words I always love in a sprint review. You mean I can ask for what I need? Right?
Yeah.
And everybody's like, well, that's the whole, exactly. That was the whole purpose. And now, magic starts to happen. Really cool collaboration starts to happen.
Like when I first started doing sprint reviews, we actually called them demos. Yeah. And I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, okay, it's the same thing. But that terminology really matters. The demo made it sound like I'm done. And here it is. It's finished. Versus really that review and what the importance of just that slight word change mattered in terms of the mindset and the approach of what went into that room. To be able to go, I hear the sigh, and like, yes, now we get to find out what's going on. Because, the old school ways of going, well, if you just done requirements better, I promise you, no business person, no stakeholder is sitting there going, I'm not going to tell them. I'm going to wait until user acceptance testing and not accept it.
Right.
Right? Like nobody's doing that.
No, nobody does that.
And
when you see that is when the stakeholders aren't there.
Yeah, well,
and again, I've seen this, right? I've seen teams where they go, hey, the backlog is so well expressed, there's no reason for a stakeholder to be there. It's a waste of their time to be here. Because we really clearly understood the requirements really well. I've never had that go well. I've let people run that experiment with a lot of complaining on my part because I know what's going to happen. And what happens is they get done with the whole set of things in that release, if you will, several sprints worth of stuff that they're going to put in production. And then all of a sudden there's well, wait a minute. I don't understand why that looks this way or why does this, all that would have been found through a set of sprint reviews. And so.
Okay, so we have a question here
already?
Already. Look at that. If you don't have something that has a UI, user interface, something that's up front, but it was part of the sprint work, what do you do during the sprint review? And I'm sticking with I get the question.
Why I was going to say, hand the phone
you
over
start.
To me.
No.
So I get creative. So there's a couple. We can go down a rat hole around this one, right? One, I like your business is saying it's done, and it's done from the perspective. I always say what the story needs to have meaning to the stakeholder, right? It has to have value to the stakeholder. So even if I'm building something that takes a whole bunch of pieces, the stakeholder has to appreciate that the pieces are actually building to the total.
What it's going towards, right? What that algorithm
is going to help. So I get creative about that. I'm an electrical engineer by training, right? I have a lot of I have a lot of people who write firmware, and they go, you can't possibly demo a driver, right? And by the way, you can't write a driver in 2 weeks, right? And I'm sitting there going, well, I'm not so sure that you can't make some increment of a driver done in 2 weeks, and you can't demonstrate something about that aspect of it, right? And I'll never forget the first one I saw this, they literally had a camera in the lab pointing at the piece of hardware with an LED blinking, okay? And they could show that, hey, we can now tell the LED to stop blinking, boom, and it stopped blinking. And then it started blinking, and I'll tell you, there was actually applause in the room, right?
For a blinking
light. For a blinking LED, right? So you can always make it meaningful in some way.
Well, and so I've had times where there was a technical aspect, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of technical debt and my feelings on that. That should not be referred to as technical debt, but because you can't avoid it per se. But there are some times that there is work that the team is doing that indirectly, more so than directly, like we've got to fix this so we can speed up and use a new technology that's coming. We had to get rid of something that was holding us back,
like
or whatnot.
Replacing a OS or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, or we were using a certain specific vendor, a certain tool, and we're going to go to a different tool now, or things like that. but I think there's still value. Like what I will highlight is like, even if there's nothing to like visually show, the conversation is still part of that discussion. Like, what did you learn? What did you gain? What is this going to open up?
Right.
Because that's that discovery of, okay, now that we've done this, what's possible?
Or even setting the stage for something in the future. Hey, by doing this, we believe this will happen in the
This
next
value.
And now I come back at some point in time and I say, hey, remember that? Here is what we were able to accomplish as a result of that. Right? So you don't have to do it in the moment.
Have you ever had, how do you deal as a Scrum Masters in particular when you have team members that want to like, well, I need 4 hours to prepare for this sprint.
Yeah. It still comes back to one of my favorite reframes, which is the time frames are shorter, right? So you're talking about demonstrating typically 8 days worth of work for a 2-week sprint, right?
Yep.
How much content, how much preparation do you need to do for that amount of work, right? Really? I mean, the other thing is that it tends to become when I do a lot of preparation, it shows up like I did a lot of preparation, right? So it shuts down the collaboration in some ways.
Well, a lot of times I'm finding when they do try to do a lot of they're actually creating videos so they don't have to do it live.
Oh.
Like, and nothing can go wrong. And I'm like, no, that's kind of the opposite point of the sprint review. My harder one is when I'm really like, I challenged a lot of teams early on. We had it when I came into a team once where only one person kind of showed everything
did everything.
All the product backlog items that were completed. And I was like, well, why can't everybody talk to their own stuff? There's a sense of pride in what they're doing. And I had one individual, he was so nervous to talk. And he was so like, his wasn't even like just the preparation. It was actually getting up in front of people and doing it. And he was so just nervous about it. And I was torn. I was like, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing, right? Like maybe I need to pull back. Like he's sweating.
Really getting to him.
Yeah, it's really getting to him.
Yeah, most people think it's public speaking like that is worse than death.
Right, like, and there is that public speaking aspect, especially when you're dealing with stakeholders, and I think it amplifies that. I'm not sure I was always a supportive because I lack that fear.
Yeah, I know.
Like, I have it just doesn't happen, and so I don't always have the level of empathy that I need to for that situation. But I do still remember him coming up to me afterwards and saying it was worth it. Like he was like, I want to do it again. And he did it. He kept doing it over and over again afterwards. I'm not sure it got super easy for him ever. He would still get really anxious about it. But he challenged himself, and I applaud that.
Grew.
Yeah, he grew. And I think there's those opportunities, especially as a Scrum Master within the team, that, like you said, the collaboration, but also just that internal growth for people in this type of meeting to engage with stakeholders when they tend to be, as people put, scary or have unfounded fears.
Yeah, the other thing that sometimes is behind that question is the fear of failure. The fear of showing up as a failure, and what would be the consequence of demoing something and it didn't work, or being a little
or getting feedback that
this
isn't what I want.
And it's one of the things that frankly, in the review is probably the safest place, in my opinion, for a lot of organizations to be able to do that. People understand that it's a work in progress, even though you've got a done piece. The overarching thing is a work in progress, right? So
yeah, but I think that's change. That's such a change. Like I mentioned it a second ago, we've created an environment for so long for so many teams where the final stage was user acceptance testing. What did you want a user to do?
UAT.
You wanted them to accept it. And what was the last thing they ever did during user acceptance testing? Accept it. And I think there's a lot of history there of expectation on both sides that, without that reinforcing that the feedback is the positive, that it's hard to not internalize that. It's hard to not personalize that.
No, I'm not dismissing the emotional aspect of internalizing it, but you kind of have to ask yourself, am I preparing because I'm afraid that I'm going to, show up bad? And in fact, learning something, it's a complex world. They're going to ask a question that you haven't thought of. Right, they're going to ask the software to do something that perhaps you didn't think of. Yay!
This made me think of there was a time when we were in a sprint review and something went wrong, like it totally didn't work, and they actually high-fived. they were like, yes, we found it here.
Infamous failure bow.
It was kind of a version
Uh-huh.
of the failure bow in that, thankfully, we found it then. It was a weird situation. It was an odd, dynamic of exactly how we found it in there, but it was like grateful. We found it here, not live, not out in production with it.
Yeah. The other thing is we've mentioned UAT at this point. So I'll text a question here.
You're gonna ask me. You can't come up with your own questions.
I most certainly can. What is your perspective about UATs relative to sprint reviews?
I'd say a little bit more of what you're looking for.
Well, I get a lot of people going. So we do these sprint reviews and then we do a UAT at the end.
Oh,
yeah.
So that causes me kind of a like, why? Typically, if I have something, I'm trying to even think if I've ever had that scenario. I think the closest I've come to having a scenario like that is when there's big integration across, and so it's not even user acceptance testing. It's like this, like integration testing. Now we got to do integration testing across the whole, and that's where I do look at some. Well, if we're going to break up the work to where all the work isn't contained in the team, how do we actually incorporate these sprint reviews so that they're doing that together in the sprint review and not, okay, now we have a whole nother tier of doing another round of testing. And a review. Because for me, at that point, I would almost want that like validation of done being not done in the sprint review, but just, hey, our part is done. But if it goes to the bigger product backlog item, which actually incorporates another team, I want that happening together and not necessarily separate. I've tried to really avoid that situation as much as possible just by how I'm breaking up the teams, honestly.
It's interesting. I usually get that question when we're doing a teams class. Right, they've not done this before.
Because this is what they expect to do.
Yeah, it's part of the overall process.
That's the security blanket in a lot of cases. Like, okay, there's no more changes.
That's the process, so we have to follow the process, right? And so I always say, hey, just think about it. If you're really delivering an increment that the stakeholder could actually say is done and makes sense to them, what value does a UAT create at the end? And if your stakeholders ever tell you that they have to have a UAT, perhaps that's an opportunity for you to reflect on what are the stories you're creating, right? Yeah. Are they meaningful to the stakeholder? Because you really shouldn't need a UAT after you sprint.
It makes me think of a scenario, now that I think about it a little bit more, of actually holding on to what you said, holding on to the process, right? Like, I can fake the done. My definition of done is not really explicit. It's not really done. And so as long as my part is done, then because we're still going to have this huge part of regression testing and automate, all that's going to still happen, and we need to do our performance testing. We're going to do that all later because we're not going to release for a little while. But you start losing all the value of being able to give the business options of when to release and how when you do that. But
that's a big piece.
But it ties into that sticking with my existing process, and that's when that happens. Versus I can't possibly fit that in these 2 weeks as well. As a Scrum Master, if you kind of keep going, well, yeah, that makes sense. We'll just keep delaying it. None of the technical excellence practices that need to start happening will happen because they'll constantly say, well, we can do that after the review, which then at that point, the review is a check-in, not actually kind of a discovery. And I would probably go back to expanding that definition of done in order to start incorporating those other things and dealing with those problems of handoffs.
I love it when teams run into the process police, as I call them, right? Who say you have to run a UAT, and their stakeholders go, this is redundant. Why would I do that, right? That's when you know that you've done the right level of done work in each sprint. If I say done, I was trying to figure out squeeze done in there one more time.
done. So I'm smiling because you said process police, and there is an element that I'm going to tangent for just a second, but we've been talking a lot about this, and they have good intent, right?
Oh yeah,
like, they have good intent. There was a reason at one time user acceptance testing was a solution to the way that we were developing and what we were doing, and it helped with those areas. And I think a lot of times we're not bringing along all of those different teams and knowledge and specializations, and only bringing them along by like pulling them by a leash and saying, hey, just suck it up. But starting to incorporate them, like, okay, what do you think is missing, right? Why do you think this still has to happen?
Right, it's the why. Yeah, it's a big piece of the why. I are the process police. I mean, I played that role for for decades, right?
I can see
and what would happen is that you would get so caught up in the process that you forgot that why, right? And so what I liked about it was it caused you to pause and say, yeah, why are we doing a UAT? What is the value? Is there a more effective way of doing it, given the way we're now approaching it, right? It's usually one of the very first things in the typical large enterprise end game that goes away when I see Scrum get implemented. Is UAT is the first thing to drop because it just becomes irrelevant.
Okay, so we got another question. If we're always able to change requirements, how is anything ever going to get done?
That's a good question, Tricia.
Don't!
If we're always going to be changing requirements, wow. That's assuming that there's not a sense by the stakeholders that there's a crossover point in the value that's been created that I wouldn't want to start getting a return on that. I mean, it's an interesting, boy, this is a complicated question. Well, you can go into this one for a while. Stakeholders are interested in getting something out there, right? Because they do want a return on investment. There's a problem to be solved. That's why I like the fact that we've stopped talking about these as sprint reviews, or demos, excuse me, and stopped talking about it as a review. Because the review part for me is, okay, given where we're at, given what we have left to do or we plan to do, where do we stand right now? Are we ready to ship something because we do a small little, let's tie this piece off? Or it's good enough now, right?
Well,
or in fact, you know what? We need these things, so are we really focused on those things being the next thing to deliver out of there, right? I personally don't worry about, I know it's a constant worry that we're just going to continue to change until the end of the cows come home, so to speak.
But they're incentivized to actually release something.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of...
typically goes away.
I think there's a lot of this is another area where there's a lot of baggage. We basically looked at stakeholders for years and said, you get one shot in the next year or two.
Oh, yeah.
What all do you need in? And so everything needed to go in because I only got one shot. Everything was required. Everything was necessary. And I think about how many applications that stuff never gets used.
Well, we called it gilding the lily.
Yeah,
right.
Like,
we put gold on the lily, and the lily was pretty enough as it was.
And we over feature things and we overdo things when we could have gotten a return on investment much earlier. And that is changing. I mean, the nice part is I think our industry and how fast things are changing is kind of forcing this topic because you can't wait years now to release. And so I think it's kind of forcing that hand anyways. But I do think that there's a lot of existing baggage on both ends of the I have to need everything before we can release from the stakeholder perspective. But there's also from the development team's perspective of they're never going to stop. They're always going to keep asking for more versus when do we, feel progress. And
there's also the aspect that feeds into that, which is that traditionally we're actually pretty poor at predicting what we can deliver when as well. So now you put those two things together, right? And you got quite a cauldron of, what ifs, maybe, could have, should have, can we? I mean, it really becomes terribly complex that way. So I always encourage teams, if you as a team can get to a place where you're pretty darn consistent, you're pretty good about, and again, we all know that the bear eats you and the bee, sometimes you eat the bear kind of a thing, right? But if I'm fairly, you like that one? If I'm fairly consistent at being able to say what I'm going to deliver and deliver what I said, right? Then you have this opportunity, and you see this a lot, where a stakeholder said, it would be nice to have.
Yeah.
And then you put that up against something like a release backlog, and you go, yeah, I agree it's nice to be had. Given where we're at, based upon that we can consistently deliver, here's when we're going to deliver, how nice is it for you to have?
Yeah.
Does it fit in here, or does it really fit down and below in here? And it removes one of the variables. It really kind of clarifies what's at stake when you decide to change something or not, or to add something, or even delete something for that matter.
I also just always kind of remind everybody involved in it, right? Like there's an emotional aspect to it, but there's also the emotional aspect of if you continue down this path and you just stick to the existing things that were said and you don't discover and you just deliver and you're like, done, I'm done. You know, I've built code that's never been used. I've spent hours, late nights doing things only to deliver. It met requirements. It was on time. It was on budget, right? And then never used.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel good. It sucks. It's a horrible feeling to have spent all this time to build something only to not be valued. And so I started changing that thought process of going, the valuing part was them being able to go, oh my gosh, that is not what I need. Here's what I really need. I'm like, yes, I did it, right? Like I gave them something to find that out. And that is success, because what I don't want is to still deliver that original thing and be like, tough, you said that's what you want. I'm done. And not have them use it. I don't want to spend that amount of effort towards something that never gets used.
Yeah.
And just because it met the contract, that's not a feel good for anybody. And I think when you start putting that into perspective, and start redefining that success in terms of that feedback, sprint reviews take on a whole different purpose and a whole different meaning and value to Scrum teams.
The other thing I like to interject is metrics, and I know for some people metrics is a dirty word.
You're going to open up the metric thing with 3 minutes remaining?
But if I've got something like a release burnout, right?
Yeah.
And I am representing that the additions to the backlog are coming from all these adds and changes. And again, predicated that I, as an Agile team, am very consistent about my ability to plan and deliver.
Which doesn't happen immediately.
Right. No, it doesn't. But you can get there pretty quick. You know. So if I do that, it becomes this kind of unarguable piece of objective data. You can simply say, look at that, right? And, you know, people may not like the answer still. There still may be some emotions in it, but it doesn't become a you versus me kind of a thing. It doesn't become a, well, if you would only deliver what I ask you to deliver, or if you'd only stop giving me excuses of why you can't deliver. It removes a piece of, removes a piece of the arguability to the thing. And it becomes about, well, that's the reality. That's the truth. So what are you going to do about that truth?
Right. Instead of having a forecast or predict or things, you have something of here's the output.
Objective information.
Here's the product increment.
I'm just a sensing kind of guy, but I love objective information because I can just sit there and go, well, what does that mean to you? What is it telling you?
Right. Which is better data than the forecast and things that are based on guesses.
Right.
Which is the reality and not much work.
Right. Which is why I love teams that find that pace, find that, you know, ability, that nice cadence, that ability to plan and deliver. That's the very first thing I look at any team. What's your ability to plan and deliver to that plan?
Yeah. I really look at that, but I really call out that definition of done, because I think that
it's got to be done. Otherwise,
but you'd be surprised how many people don't share that saying, right? Like,
are you kidding? If you walk in as a coach,
it's one of the first things you probably should just ask for.
So you ask for your definition of done, right?
Like,
and it's
Paul's done or Susan's done.
The sad
right?
result is, in my experience, it's at best 8 out of 10.
But
2 out of 10 that have.
I do find that will drive more effective sprint reviews to have the actual results.
So definition done. Sure, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, for your metrics. Yeah. So our time is up.
That was an incredibly fast 30
I know,
minutes.
It really was. And now we have to go back to work and do class stuff. So
yeah, but I'm excited about it. There's some cool stuff we're building over there.
I know, but I kind of enjoy this too. So
maybe we'll come back next Friday. But next time we'll have to coordinate the shirt thing.
I know. Well, I wore Michigan State. Go green. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed. You got some benefit, and if not, sorry.
Feel free to ask us other questions
but
on our
always
Facebook
ask,
page.
yeah.
We'd be glad to respond to those as well.
Next week, I believe the sprint retrospective. I'm not sure who's going to be.
That would be the next event up in line, I would think.
I would think so, but I don't know if there's a product increment video or something.
Oh, okay,
So
gotcha.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We should have done that work beforehand, and we would have been way better. So, but might as well end. See Faluba right there.
Good.
Have a good day.
And all of you want Amadeus back, just put it on the Facebook page. We'll get him back in the next videos.
I'm assuming we're off. I hope we're off.